In this video, I'm going to show 10 ways I use cross-hatching to create 10 different effects, all of which, besides finding essential to draw the things I draw, I believe help create a strong sense of realism in what I draw. Cross-hatching is often seen as a really hard, a really difficult technique that confuses many. But I think this comes down to the fact that it's often taught in a very oversimplified way. Small boxes with patterns of hatching lines. In my experience, understanding the full range of what cross-hatching can achieve has actually helped me to not just understand it and use it more confidently, but to find it easier to draw and to be able to draw scenes of complexity I could never have drawn any other way. Let me show you the 10 ways, and at the end, I'll use one drawing that shows them all brought together. The first one is hatching and cross-hatching allows us to define complex silhouettes both in a positive and in a negative sense. So up here in this tree in the distance, we have hatching lines to indicate the foliage. We've represented the silhouette of the tree canopies in our hatching. That's a positive use of hatching. This large shrub down here, we've actually defined the silhouette edge by the background hatching, by the hatching that comes down to meet that edge. We haven't drawn the object, the shrub, we've created the space behind the object through the hatching. This is known as drawing through negative space. These are both tremendously helpful for foliage. Second point is we're able to create edges of greater subtlety in terms of what the information they convey. With these old weathered stone steps, if I'd simply drawn an outline around the edges, it would have created a very sharp-edged effect. And while there are parts where that's appropriate because some of the edges have been chipped and created a sharp edge, most of them are well-rounded from the constant walking up and down them. And so by hatching and controlling my edges, my ends of the hatching very carefully, I can create a rounded effect and therefore capture the reality of the weathering of these edges in a way that's probably not possible otherwise. The third way I use cross-hatching when I draw for realism is to create a sense of three-dimensional form by the way I hatch, basically by the direction of my hatching lines. So in this tree, I've used my hatching to emphasize the cylindrical shape of these branches, but not just their shape, also the fact that some of these branches are moving towards me in space and others are moving away from me in space. Particularly when we're using a photo as our reference for tree drawing, it's important to bring back in this spatial three-dimensionality, this sense of distance, because the photographic process very much compresses distance. It brings the further things so that they look really as close as the closest things. It's not just that we draw this branch behind the other branch, we want to draw this branch in a way so that it feels that it's further away. And we do that by both a lighter effect with our hatching lines and the values we create as it goes further away, but also by strengthening the hatching, the darkness, the line width, and so forth as branches move towards us in space. Three-dimensionality is obviously a really important part of reality. And so the more we can capture it in our mark making, the greater the effect of it we create in our drawing. The fourth area is the one that's often pitched at pretty much as the whole purpose of hatching, which is to create shade and shadow. Now, in this tree-lined country dirt road, we've used hatching for this purpose. These darker canopy areas are where the canopies are in shade, where the light can't reach these areas because of where the sun is positioned. But we also have shadow. We also have areas where other objects are blocking the light from reaching certain objects, such as these shadows across the roadway and these shadows on the grass. And we have a nice piece of negative space in creating this tree through hatching in the distance. By controlling my marks, we also have some nice underlying form, the slight curvature of the road. We've even created the wearing down of the dirt surface where the tyres of the vehicles tend to repeatedly overlap. The fifth area we have where hatching is very useful is for local colour. Now, local colour is the phrase used for a colour that's under average lighting. It's neither very bright nor very dark. And some colours are darker than other colours. And we can see that if we take the colour out of a black and white photo. In this drawing, the hatching has been used to create the dark brick colour and to particularly create the contrast between the dark brick colour and these decorative corners, which visually was a very significant part of how this gatehouse looked. The sixth way we can use cross-hatching is to create separation, to create a sense of this is one object, this is a different object, which can be very helpful when we have lots of hatching lines in a complex scene, particularly if a lot of them are creating a similar value. So with this large tree here, I've used horizontal hatching lines because that puts them in fundamentally a different direction to all of the vertical lines that I've used in this section for the hatching for other objects and other purposes. Besides making this tree stand out as a different object, it also helps reflect the underlying form, which is helpful, but it also creates clarity between the roughly vertical lines I've put on the tree already to capture a sense of the bark pattern. It would have been quicker to have done lots of vertical lines, but this tree wouldn't have stood out, and it's a very important part of the composition. Notice also my control of my hatching to leave this white space here, drawing this strappy leaf through negative space. Over here, I have this shrub created through positive space. In this corner, the value, the amount of darkness is very equal between the horizontal ground and this rise. And again, by controlling my hatching, even though the value is the same, we do very easily get a sense that this is horizontal and there's a rise starting here. Another significant way I use hatching in my drawing is to echo the perspective theory that applies to this scene. And I find this point can really make scenes look more real. So with the hatching on these tree trunks, I'm firstly thinking of eye level. I'm thinking of when we have, say, a column in architecture that's made of different drum segments. The line where we see these cylindrical segments joined together at eye level is actually going to be a straight line. But as we start to look up the column, these lines start to curve, and they curve increasingly as they move up, and as they move below eye level, they start to curve increasingly in the other direction. So the hatching I apply is not just to produce the shade on these tree trunks, but in echoing the way perspective works. It also helps create the effect of reality, of three-dimensional reality. So I can help establish a sense of eye level, of looking up and looking down from the one place, but also of foreshortening. At ground level down here, the ground is moving away from us, and the perspective theory tells us that that affects how we see the objects there. So as I hatch these shadows as they move further away, I decrease the height or the width of the shadowed areas, reflecting that with foreshortening, as things move further away from us, they appear to narrow. I also control the weight of my lines so that furthest away, not just are these narrow, but they're lightly done, whereas closer, they're much more heavily done, creating a much darker effect. And that reflects how things look as they move further away from us. This scene shows us how we can use hatching to draw overwhelming detail. There is such a large amount of visual, clutter in this scene. There's leaves and grit and dirt and stuff on every surface on the roadway, and we have plane of foliage after plane of foliage after plane of foliage moving back increasingly into the sunlight, but framed by this darker area of closer shaded and shadowed foliage. Hatching lets me simplify what I'm drawing without it becoming simplistic. Rather than drawing every leaf and trying to capture the light of that leaf. With much broader pen strokes, I can capture the effect of the foliage in that light. Hatching and cross-hatching also lets us create value. It lets us create lights and darks, and it lets us do it with great subtlety. With this tree, which is also a great example of using hatching to create a form through negative space, through drawing the behind rather than drawing the actual object. But in that behind space, it lets us capture the subtlety of the lights and darks, which of course are reflecting the subtlety of what we see of the underlying form. So whereas all of this far bank of a little creek that runs through the center is in fairly deep shade and shadow, there are parts of foliage that come closer to us that we can make out in the gloom. And cross-hatching gives me a way of great variability in the overall value I create, so that I can hatch in a way that we can start to sense that this isn't a flat black surface standing up behind. There are parts moving towards us that reflect different forms that are there. This subtlety is ever present in life, and if we want to draw with a sense of realism, we want to try and capture it in some way. In a moment, I'll show you a scene that really brings all of these points together. But in this 10th example, we see how cross-hatching can be used to actually draw light effects, to actually draw strong sunlight. Now, of course, we can't draw the light, but we can draw the effect the light has on what we see by drawing the dark areas and letting the white paper represent the brightest areas, the strongest light. Control over where we don't hatch, particularly in subjects or parts of subjects where we are heavily hatching, is a really important way to use hatching. And the more white paper we have left next to heavily hatched areas, the stronger the light will seem to be. And here we have a subject that seems to pull most of this together. Complex silhouettes, these fir trees, not to mention the trees further back. The grasses here on the sides of the path, pretty much created through hatching, creating edges with subtlety. I haven't actually drawn a line defining the edge of the path, but by controlling my hatching lines, I've created a very clear sense of edge of a path. But continuous lines drawn here would not have captured the effect of this soft edge that's in this Swiss forest. Now, there's an emphasis on creating three-dimensional form. These lines are not horizontal, they're curved slightly to reflect the curve in the path. We have hatching that reflects the slight incline of each side of the path. We have these horizontal lines to reflect the curvature of the tree, and so forth. You'll notice I've used the same principle as I've used for the tree trunks with the legs of our walkers. Now, I've obviously used hatching to create a sense of shade and shadow. I've also used hatching for local color. I've hatched the jeans that are being worn darker to reflect the local color, the dark blue of the jeans, as opposed to the colors of the jackets. So in some of these darker areas, doing my lines horizontally rather than vertically for the trunks helps the trunks to be identified more easily. But I've done the same thing up here in the distance, where my lines are lighter and further apart. The same effect can be created, giving clarity to what we're seeing. Again, I've hatched in a way to emphasize perspective and particularly foreshortening in this subject. More lines creating a heavier value closer that then lightens and becomes finer as it moves away. There's hardly a part of this where I'm not using the 8th way I use cross-hatching, which is to create the effect of detail. Obviously the trees, the forest scene, the ground, the path. I resist starting to draw anything in detail because once I start that in a scene such as this, I'm never going to know where to stop. Now, there's obviously lots of values, lots of lights and darks. Sometimes the contrasts are very great, and sometimes they're more subtle, but always being carefully and deliberately, intentionally controlled. And finally, light effects. Yes, there is a very strong sense that we're looking from a shadowed area into an area of greater brightness. That the light is coming down and hitting our walkers, casting shadows, never forget the shadows. And some of the clumps of branches we're seeing through hatching, but others that are in sunlight, we've actually drawn or suggested by leaving an appropriate part of the paper white. As I said at the start, ironically, it was by starting to draw scenes of greater complexity and by my discovering that the only way I could create something that just wasn't a jumble of marks that you couldn't work out what was what by the end was by using hatching, cross-hatching, by learning to control it. And of course, I can't draw an effect I haven't first observed. And as I did that, and as I worked hard to control it, to capture certain visual effects, to inject a sense of reality, I found that I kept discovering more ways it benefited how my drawings look. I have a cross-hatching playlist. I found changing my thinking of drawing through lines to drawing by means of marks helpful going in this direction as well. Stop me thinking that cross-hatching is basically a series of patterns, very regular, equally spaced, carefully controlled lines. Now, that sort of hatching can be very highly effective depending on what we're drawing and what our overall drawing style is. But for me, loosening up my hatching has helped me to discover the wide range of effects that I can create now when I draw using it. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hope this has been helpful. Please hit the like button if it has. And why not check out my cross-hatching playlist? But hey, in the end, whatever you draw, however it turns out, whether you hatch or don't hatch, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.